Good evening and welcome back to Empty Cloud Monastery. So this evening we're here with Bhante Jagaro, and my name is Bhante Sudaso, and we'll be speaking a bit about relationships, so how to have wholesome relationships as a lay person. Then we'll each speak for a bit about the topic, and then if there's any questions or comments, we'll happily take questions or comments. So if you have questions, you can type them in at any time, and we'll either take them at the end, or if they seem immediately relevant, we might take them as they appear. So don't hesitate to type in questions as we go. So we'll begin by paying homage to the Buddha. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhang dhammang sanghang namasami. So the topic for this evening is wholesome relationships. Before we started, actually just a few minutes ago, when Venerable Jagaro found out what the topic was, his comment was that it was a bit odd to have monks talking about this. But actually I think it's quite relevant because this is within the domain of Dhamma. So the basic guideline that the Buddha gives as a starting point is the third precept. So the third precept in Pali is kamesu miccācara veramani. So refraining from miccācara, which means wrong conduct or misconduct. And kamesu means in regarding sensuality. And when the Buddha gives a more detailed description of this precept in various places in the suttas, he's describing it in terms of adultery or cheating on one's partner. So either knowingly having sexual relations with someone who's already in a committed relationship, or if you are in a committed relationship, then getting sexually involved with people outside of that relationship without the consent of your partner. Also cases of sexual assault, or what these days we would call breaking consent, so breaking the boundaries of consent, or getting sexually involved with children. So again, what these days we would call statutory rape. So it's also as an example the Buddha gave of sexual misconduct. So then the basic minimum guideline that the Buddha gives is refraining from sexual misconduct of this sort. So again, things like breaking the consent boundary, or breaking the trust boundary within a committed relationship. Interestingly enough, so something which did come up in conversation recently is that although the Buddha had several prominent disciples who were prostitutes, the Buddha never seems to have directly condemned that livelihood, nor does it seem to directly fit under the precept of kamesu miccācara. So that's an interesting but relatively minor side point. But normally when we're talking about cultivating wholesome relationships, we're not talking in these very broad terms, but rather for someone who is already in a committed relationship. How is one to approach that in a wholesome way, a supportive way? So of course, as celibate monastics, we've taken a somewhat different approach to relationships, which is to completely remove the sexual component from our interactions with other people. Actually, one quote which always comes to mind whenever this comes up is many, many years ago, I met a Catholic monk named Brother David Steindl-Rast, who was a Camaldolese monk, if I recall correctly. Camaldolese monk who also practiced Buddhist meditation and regularly went to a Buddhist monastery that was close to his monastery, which is how I met him. And would do Buddhist meditation at the end of the evening prayer service at his monastery. So it was optional for the other monks. So it wasn't required as part of the monastery schedule, but it was part of the unofficial monastery schedule. So a very interesting character. But one thing he said is he said, when I decided to love everyone equally, I realized that meant I had to be either celibate or extremely promiscuous. And naturally he chose celibacy. It's a little bit easier, a little bit simpler lifestyle. You had a thought on that?
It's interesting. He said that. I recall as a layperson not having that exact thought, but something very similar. But basically, I was thinking about maybe the more how do you say, maybe more the caring part of a intimate relationship, and that how that part could actually be done independent of any sort of sexual relationship, and that it seemed like, that basic notion of caring, why does it have to be limited to one person? In fact, it seems like any relationship, there's going to be an aspect of care to it. And so not, I didn't quite, go so far as to think, maybe I'll just, sex with everybody, or, love everybody. But it was starting to broaden my scope, as opposed to just like, why are we focusing on just one person? And of course, it's also interesting too, because different points in my life, I think, in more modern times, there's been a sort of a more, for some people, they've are interested in trying to find ways of having sexual relationships that aren't with multiple people, that aren't how do you say, involve deceit or going behind people's back or hurting people. It's often called polyamory, I think, these days. And I remember when I was introduced to this, and I remember thinking about this for a while, and I was like, obviously there's, that might sound fun on one level, but then I was thinking, well, that sounds really complicated, and like 2, 3, like Jesus is sorry. That's sorry. I shouldn't say that's wrong religion to say. I'm trying to refine my speech, and sometimes when I have an epithet, I still go back to this kind of old lay epithet. So, anyways, it was quite. I recall thinking about the complications of having many different relationships, intimate relationships. But then when I kind of scaled it back, it was like, but if there's just the kind of the care part, which is actually quite light and not involving this kind of, wanting to glob on to things, then it actually seemed like it started to make sense. So.
Yeah, and I think that's a very important point to keep in mind, is that, so whenever we're talking about a romantic relationship, the most important component from a Dhamma standpoint, the most important component is that element of mutual care, of genuine kindness, thoughtfulness, consideration, compassion between the people involved. And actually, whether it's 2 people or 3 people or 20 people is from just strictly in terms of the Dhamma we find in the suttas, it actually doesn't matter at all. again, the Buddha had many polyamorous disciples. So some of his disciples were, again, as I mentioned, prostitutes. Some of his disciples were people who had men who had multiple wives, as was not uncommon in the time of the Buddha. And so in these cases, the Buddha, again, he never directly condemned polyamory. He never even indirectly condemned polyamory. But rather, he gave these same general guidelines. He's saying, so what he did give as advice was to respect your partner, care for your partner, help them with their duties and responsibilities, see what you can do to make their life easier and more comfortable. So he was always giving this advice, like if one is in a intimate relationship, then one's primary duty is to care about your partner and to express that not just through speech, but through action, to actually physically do tangible things that make your partner's life easier and more comfortable and more manageable. And as you were pointing out, Venerable, it doesn't need to be limited only to our sexual partners, whether it's one or multiple is beside the point. But rather optimally, what we're doing is we're trying to cultivate this attitude of kindness, compassion, and consideration towards every single person in our life. But often it's supportive to learn how to do that with a single person with whom we already have a commitment to. So this is actually one of the values that I see in a committed romantic relationship, is that it creates a training environment for cultivating these qualities of kindness and consideration and thoughtfulness and respectfulness towards one person. So it's kind of like focused training environment for cultivating these really wholesome qualities of mind. And then as you cultivate that with one person, then you can start to learn how to cultivate those same attitudes in a non-sexual way towards other people as well. And one also can start to recognize that those qualities are not directly tied to sexuality. So this is part of where like the word love becomes very muddled, is that often when we use the word love, we just automatically bring in elements of sexuality, but actually those aren't necessarily inherent. So rather it's cultivating this loving heart in the sense of metta, karuna, mudita, upekkha, in the sense of kindness, compassion, in the sense of thoughtfulness and consideration and genuine caring about another person, and expressing it. Also along those lines, I'm thinking of the Kosambhya Sutta. No, not the Kosambhya Sutta. What's the one where there's the three monks living together in a hermitage?
I don't know the name, but I know what you're talking about.
And the Buddha asked them, like, how are you able to get along so well? And one of the monks says, well, whenever I think of my companions, I always, they say, for example, I think, what do they want to do? What would they like? How would they like to do things? And then I set aside what I want to do, and instead I see what I can do to do what they want to do instead. And each one of the three had the same attitude. So when all of them are thinking, I'll do what my companions want to do, then you wind up with an incredibly loving community. And also this attitude of, and this one actually is from the Kosambhya Sutta. The Buddha talks about maintaining metta with body, speech, and mind, both publicly and privately, towards one's companions. Again, not just having a mind of loving kindness, but also saying things based on loving kindness and doing things based on loving kindness. And also not just when other people know about it, but also doing things which are maybe secret, maybe nobody will know. Like a random act of kindness, which you never even find out who did it for you, but you just, like, you wake up one day and there's your laundry neatly folded outside your door, and you actually have no idea who did it. And you're like, oh, how lovely. So also being willing to do things for others without hoping for recognition or expectation of any particular result. Do you have any comments you want to take the topic and run with?
Yeah, there's, a couple of things that jump to mind. One, in terms of cultivating relationships with respect, the fourth precept around not lying, or the one of the full, one of the trainings of the Noble Eightfold Path, right speech, which includes not lying, but also includes not using harsh speech, or harsh or malicious speech, not sort of idly gossiping, and hold on, there's 1, 2, 3, 4. I feel like I'm missing something.
Yeah, there's 4 kinds of right speech. Yeah.
Did I
Let's go through the list
Yeah.
again. Harsh speech,
malicious speech,
divisive speech.
Divisive speech. Okay,
Yeah.
Okay, and then
Useless speech.
useless speech,
Sampapalapa. Yeah.
and then of course dishonest.
Yeah, telling lies.
Yeah,
false speech.
And that this is actually quite important in any kind of relationship. And of course, as Bhante Sudasu mentioned, by focusing on one person, like, you may find it, let's say, hard to commit to, if you're not quite your kind of, I've heard somebody use the word like boo curious, or
curious.
Yeah. So like if you're, not quite, settled on Buddhism, not willing to take it on entirely, but you're just kind of checking it out and kind of thinking about it. And you're not ready to take on the precepts, so or the training as a whole. And so what you can do is you can go, okay, what if I take on this training for one person, right? What if I commit to, always being honest with this person? What if I commit to always not saying anything out of trying to harm them, or trying to sort of, gain favor with them or another person or something like that, and not just, kind of talking for no reason, or, and kind of the flip side, not the flip side, but an adjacent to that is actually, listening to them. If one can commit to that, then one is starting to get a sense for the benefits of actually following the Buddhist teachings, and you'll have that experience with one person. And so that's one way that one can use an intimate relationship and apply the Buddhist teachings in a way for people that are, like I said, they're interested in Buddhism, but they're not quite ready to make a full leap into being a full disciple. I think that's, you said many things very well, so I don't think there's too much more I can add to what you said, Venerable Snow.
And so the topic for this evening also seems to include broader understandings of relationships, so also family relationships between relatives and family members. Do you want to say anything about that?
Yeah. So in many ways, as Bhante said, I believe there's a number of suttas where the Buddha describes basically, for example, with one's parents. There's a famous quote that he gives that, they sort of try to describe how much one's parents have done for us, in the sense of a debt that we can't repay. And so I think if I'm not, please correct me if I'm wrong, it would describe trying to carry one's parents on one's shoulders for 100 years, taking care of them, even including them defecating on you. And even if you did that, you still couldn't pay back this debt. And, I remember a teacher reflecting on this, and one of the things that they're mentioning was that, when we were very young, a baby or very young, we're quite literally we would die if there wasn't somebody taking care of us. And so presumably if it's our parents taking care of us, this is it's a very profound amount of connection that and gifts that they've given us. And I think that's quite helpful in our modern times when there's we live in a very psychological culture, and understandably so. There's a lot of understanding of how our experience of life is very much shaped by our early experience, both when we were babies or kids. And of course, our parents were very instrumental in that. And so there can often be a lot of resentment or hurt or blame associated with finding out. I often hear lay people say, gosh, if my parents were well adjusted, then I wouldn't be so crazy. And maybe on some level that's true. What it tends to look at the situation in a very kind of narrow sense. And what I mean by that is that there's a lot that our parents or whoever our caregivers have done for us. And I think what the Buddha is trying to do, and for example, in describing the positive gifts that the parents have done for us, is to try to recognize the entirety of it. And of course, I'm saying all this knowing that some people have experience with their parents that are, we're not just talking like frustrating or not, but just quite actively, the parents that were malicious or harmful, or even in some cases, parents that tried to kill their children. So it's not, I say all this understanding that there's a lot of different experiences that people have with their parents or caregivers. But I think for many, if not most of us, regardless of any frustrations we have with the relations we have with our parents, it's important to heed the Buddha's words around this and try to keep a broader perspective on everything that they may have done for us. Of course, I'm always, this only focuses on parents, but I think there's, siblings, brothers and sisters, other people that have been involved in our lives, like our uncles or aunts or nephews or cousins. Many times our grandparents, many people have been involved with raising us or nurturing us. And I think these basic principles apply as well. Venerable, I was wondering if you had any other thoughts about relationships with family, or...
I think you gave a pretty thorough description. One thing that does come to mind, though, is I don't actually remember what sutta this appears in, but it's when the Buddha is talking about the proper use of wealth as a layperson. And he's saying how he gives this idea of expanding circles of wealth. And so the first basic thing is keeping yourself alive and healthy. The next basic use of wealth is to look after your family. So your family and relatives, making sure that they have enough and they're provided for. Then the next application of wealth is donations to samanas and brahmins, so to religious practitioners and spiritual leaders in the community. And then making donations to support society as a whole, so supporting charitable projects within the broader society, broader community. So this idea of kind of like the proper use of wealth as being this kind of expanding circles of your first priority is keeping yourself and your family, making sure that you're okay. And then once your basic needs are met, then you start donating any excess to the spiritual leaders, and then to society as a whole, so supporting your community in a broader sense. But what I find notable about this is that, again, he's starting with saying that your first duty, your first use of wealth after taking care of yourself, your first duty with wealth is to take care of your family. And then, and of course, then he's saying also to look after the religious leaders and also to contribute to society. So it's not like hoarding everything only for yourself, but it's also not hoarding everything only for you and your family. But we do have this responsibility to distribute any excess wealth we have on a broader scale. But there's still this idea that our core duty is to make sure ourselves and our family are properly taken care of. So the Buddha does have this, he does seem to communicate this idea that we have a certain higher degree of responsibility towards our immediate family members than we do towards the broader society. So I'm wondering if you have thoughts on that.
Well, to me, it maybe it doesn't add too much to say it makes sense. I will say that one of the things I was surprised by when I entered monasticism, at least this was as taught by and exemplified by Ajahn Paso, both of our who ordained both of us, is that the relationship he had with his mother, he was incredibly caring, and I'm trying to figure out how to put this. Very caring, and like not just in a like you were saying before, in a speech way, but in a practical way. He would, for example, he often would try to organize if there was, let's say, a donor that was interested in helping him and his mother out. Then he was like, okay, let's find a place to take my mother on vacation. That's, let's say she lives in Canada, so let's find a place that's warm, right, for the winter. I think they went to Hawaii one year.
Oh, cute.
And when he does take care of it, it's almost like taking care of when I saw it was almost like taking care of royalty. If you're familiar with monastic circles, that when you see a monk take care of a revered senior, that was very much the attitude he had towards his mother, and that's just not something you see very often in our culture. And so I was quite taken by that. Again, because it was unusual for our culture, or at least and from what I experienced, and it started to make a lot of sense in terms of this is like a way of establishing a sense of well-being in oneself, because one knows that one's mother or father is taken care of, but also that they're honored in a principled way, in a tangible way, and yeah, it was, and of course, this was something that he didn't do for everybody. He was very particular about his mother, so it made a lot of sense, and it also impacted others, because again, it impacted me, it impacted anybody around that saw this. It was quite uplifting to see it in practice. So that's what comes to mind. I guess we have some questions.
There are, and there's actually several questions related to parents. So I think that might be a good topic to carry on with.
Okay.
But first off, hello to all the people joining in online. So hello to Karen, Kumu, Sud, Jayanta, Julie, John, Kobe, Manal, Pial, Hoa, Yuri, Bhumika, Richard, Mary, Anthony, and Laylee. And Manny, good to see lots of people joining in online. And Sud had a question. Sud says, why is it that the relationship between mother and child is elevated to a high level, like in the Karniya Metta Sutta? It seems like a mother or child's relationship seems full of attachment to each other.
Mm-hmm.
Well, so first off, I think that what the Buddha is doing there, so in the Karaniya Metta Sutta, he says that just as a mother cares for her only child, in the same way we should care for all sentient beings. So I think there the Buddha is presenting the ideal mother-child relationship. So the ideal mother-child relationship is where the mother has a absolute unconditional love for their child and will do absolutely anything for the well-being of their child because they care about the child so much. But the kind of unwholesome attachment that you're referring to is not ideal. So the Buddha is not saying that we should be deeply attached to all sentient beings. But rather he's saying that we should care about all sentient beings just as if they were our own child. So like when your own child is sick, usually you care quite a bit and you want to try to help them get better. When your child is sad, you want to try to make them happy. When your child is struggling, you try to find some way to make their life a bit easier. So because you care. Whereas when some random stranger is having a hard time, you're just like, whatever, suck it up, dude. So the Buddha is saying instead, you should treat even that random stranger as though they were your own child and care about them with that same genuine compassion. But yeah, it is true that people tend to have a very strong attachment to their children. And again, we're using the word attachment here in the Buddhist sense, not in the modern psychology sense. So I learned a little while back that they use the word attachment in a somewhat different way.
Yeah.
So just as a general blanket rule, whenever I'm talking, I'm using words in the Buddhist sense, not in the modern psychology sense. Yeah, so again, he's talking about that ideal attitude of deep, unconditional love without that unwholesome element of attachment that does often creep in. And those are my thoughts anyway. Do you have any thoughts on this?
No, that's great. I mean, one of I remember reading, I think it was Ajahn Jeff. He actually had a interpretation of that section of the Karaniya Metta Sutta, and if I'm not mistaken, he likened that to actually protecting that kind of the way that the mother loving the child as a way of like caring for one's own metta. If that makes any sense. You're basically taking extreme care of your own mind, which I thought was great because that's when you're practicing sati and or mindfulness, that's a very important part of it. Really, to develop it fully, we need to really take care of our mind. And similarly, if we're going to develop metta fully, we really need to take care of it. One of the things I think that I don't know if this is true, but this is my kind of reading the suttas, and I was wondering maybe if you'd be willing to share your feedback on an interpretation I have. I get the impression that the Buddha, when he says things, he's intentionally sometimes meaning it to have, or he wants it to have multiple meanings.
Yeah.
And I was wondering if you also see that as well.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, I think the Buddha often deliberately spoke in double meanings. Yeah. Okay. And Pial says, is celibacy possible for Buddhist monks and other practitioners because of jhana, rapture, and bliss obtained at will is much beyond the ordinary sense pleasure? I mean, the truth is I've known plenty of people who were celibate and who did not have jhana and weren't even meditation practitioners. They just either weren't interested in sex, or they had other priorities in their life, or there were just other things that they wanted to do that didn't involve being involved with sexuality. So no, I don't think that you need to attain jhana in order to be celibate. Lots of people seem to be quite capable of celibacy without jhana. That said, the Buddha does say in some places in the suttas, he does say that the attainment of jhana does greatly reduce one's interest in ordinary sensuality, because you've experienced something that's much more refined. You've experienced a much superior form of pleasure. So then naturally one's interest in inferior forms of pleasure diminishes by contrast. It's kind of like if you've spent your whole life drinking Sunny D, like this artificially flavored corn syrup thing that's meant to resemble orange juice. And then one day somebody actually gives you a glass of freshly squeezed organic orange juice, and you're like, oh, this is orange juice. That other thing I've been drinking all my life is actually not orange juice, and it's also not that great. So in the same way, like we go through our life thinking that things like food and chocolate and sex and movies and music are like the greatest thing ever. And then you get jhana and you're like, oh, there's something a lot better. And it's not only better, but it's also feels much healthier. So just as drinking a glass of freshly squeezed organic orange juice feels much healthier than chugging artificially flavored corn syrup, in the same way, like the happiness and pleasure that comes through deep samadhi feels much healthier, much cleaner than the pleasure that comes through ordinary sensuality. So it is true that is a supportive condition for celibacy, but it's not a necessary condition, in my opinion.
I would agree with that.
Okay. You're also welcome to disagree with me, by the way. It makes for more interesting conversations. And Pial also says, in one stanza, trust is named as the most important factor for good relationships. Does it come up in other sutta texts?
I'm not sure what he's referring to.
I don't know either. So Pial, if you can find the specific stanza and send it to us, that would be helpful. Because then we can also see what the Pali word is and see if we can track down more information on that. And Yuri says, why should we be responsible to pay a debt to our parents? It was their choice to have kids. Did we ask to be born? I understand to do right by them when they have been kind to us, but nowadays parents suck. Entitled. They can be cruel and prevent you from the practice. They can be impossible. So what are your thoughts about this?
Was there one?
No, this was just clarifying.
Clarifying.
So saying, did we ask to be born?
So why should we be responsible to pay a debt to our parents? So I don't get the impression the Buddha was saying we have to repay that debt. It was more about that they've given us something that we actually can't repay. And in particular, in that way, he did give a way of saying we could repay. And I believe, if I'm not mistaken, it was, for example, one of the things was if your parent wasn't established in generosity, establish them in generosity. If they weren't established in sila, establish them in sila. There are one or two more, I believe.
I think samadhi and panya.
Samadhi and panya.
But I'd have to look it up.
Yeah. Well, the point is, if you can help your parent establish them in wholesome and skillful habits and karma and a life in that direction, that's a way of actually repaying them. And I'm guessing that he probably gave that talk to either, was it to a single person or a group? Do you recall?
I don't remember.
I don't recall. But whoever the audience was, whether it was a single person or a group of people, that there was probably an assumption of wanting to pay back a debt to one's parents. Maybe that was cultural at the time or something like that. That'd be my guess for why he was that he gave that sutta in that way. So I wouldn't say you have to pay back a debt to your parents, but maybe I think to your point that parents, like, one person can have parents that are, very loving, very kind, very generous, and another person can have parents that quite literally try to kill them, sexually assault or rape them. I mean, just I've heard or read stories are just like unbelievably tragic. Of course, those are hopefully not too common. I don't, but usually for most of us, it's somewhere in the middle of that spectrum, and where parents have done very wholesome things for us. They take, again, use an example of, when we were young and incapable of taking care of ourselves, they were the ones taking care of us. Or assuming your parents, for some people, it's somebody else, but whoever that was, that somebody had to take care of us when we were unable to take care of ourselves. And that's worth keeping in mind. I remember one um, thing that I noticed when I was younger as a layperson. I had a relative that many people in the family um, found very objectionable. He had a bit of not a bit, quite a lot of sort of abrasion to his personality and how he looked at the world. And so it really bothered a lot of people in the extended family. And I noticed I didn't have as much of a either resentment, or I actually felt not close to him, but I felt somewhat affectionate towards him. And I realized part of the reason for that was because he saved what I believe, my best memories, he saved my life on two separate occasions. Mm-hmm. And so while he, did many of the same behaviors towards me as he did towards other people, and I didn't, they weren't pleasant per se. There was another part of me I was able to kind of bring up, like, yeah, that's true, but he also saved my life. Mm-hmm. And that actually really helped balance my mind. Mm-hmm. And it's a reflection I've actually used to this day, where if there's somebody, for example, that I see my mind developing resentment towards, or wanting to get back at that person for one reason or the other, I try to imagine, what if this person saved my life? But they still behave this, same way, obnoxious, cruel, aggressive, beat you up, whatever it was. But they also saved your life. How would you respond? And so I found that very helpful to me. So I think, again, I don't want to sugarcoat anybody's life that had very that parents that were did unwholesome acts towards you. But it's also it's important for us to find ways that we can balance our minds and free ourselves from the really unpleasantness of wanting ill will towards other people, wanting revenge towards other people, wanting to get back at other people. That's, regardless of whether somebody deserves it, that negatively affects you or ourselves. So it's really important to try to find ways that we can free our minds from that grip.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I would also just add briefly in terms of our parents. So one thing that the Buddha points out is that our mother carried us inside her own body for 9 months, feeding us with her own body. And actually, just recently, I spent a bit of time having some conversations with a woman who was about 8.5 months pregnant. So very, very advanced stage of pregnancy. And she was just speaking really openly about how stunningly uncomfortable it is. So those last couple months of pregnancy are really, really uncomfortable. Just the fact you have this huge thing. You have this thing the size of a watermelon inside your stomach. So all of your other internal organs are being crushed up into your torso. So she was telling me how she could actually feel how all of her internal organs were compacted and squished together, and it was hard to breathe. So 2 months where she couldn't breathe properly because her lungs were constantly squished. Like her heart couldn't beat properly because it was squished. Like none of her organs could function properly because they were all being crushed by this child growing inside her. And of course, what's the child getting its food from? The mother's body. The child is quite literally a giant parasite, like sucking the life out of your body so that it can grow. So your mother did a tremendous amount for you in those 9 months before you were born. And that's not to be swept aside lightly. Or even if she abandoned you the moment you were born, she still did 9 months of incredible service to you. As for your question, did you ask to get reborn? Actually, yeah, you did. Yeah. Yep. Sorry, you can't blame anybody else for that one. That's all on you.
I was dodging that one. And I was thinking if you're going to answer that, I should have said something.
Well, I love talking about come and rebirth, so I wasn't going to let that one slip past.
Well, it's true. You know, that's the thing. Well, I can't say it's true that I have any personal knowledge of this, but it's in the sense that the Buddha. This is what the Buddha taught. You know, it's like there's if you don't want to get reborn, well, you better listen to him.
Yeah, that's kind of what Buddhism is all about. It's about choosing to not get reborn. It's the ultimate birth control. So, so Manny asks, when a family member unfairly usurps family property, according to Dharma, should we concede or stand up for our rights in a nice manner? What do you think?
I mean, it's obviously going to depend on the situation, but yeah, you need to, how do you say, being caring doesn't mean rolling over. Does that make sense? Having a sense of kindness, of care about a person, of loving that person doesn't mean that you just go, oh, whatever you want, and I'm just going to lie down. And I think in our culture, I don't know why. Maybe it's probably other cultures too, but yeah, that's not what care is. Care is just you want like Monte said, it's like when they're sick, you want them to get well. If they're hungry, you want them fed, right? If you generally care about a person and you understand or have a faith in the Buddhist teachings, especially around karma, if somebody is doing something that's unwholesome and you care about the person, you want to stop them. You really want to stop them. And similarly, if they've already engaged in it, you want to find a way of how can I help this person see what they're doing, right? Or how can I, help this person not just keep doing the same pattern? If somebody, for example, has done something like this, like usurps family property, it probably means they've done something like this before, and if they are doing it, it means they're going to do it, likely do something like this again. So to be able to be a caring person and to say, to do what one can to try to stop this, actually can be incredibly helpful to them, regardless of whether you're successful or not. There's no guarantees or anything like that, but that my inclination is that if somebody's doing something like that, you need to, do what you can.
And Julie says, my parents have mental illness, were abusive to me, and I cut the ties 20 plus years ago. I'm sorry that you had a difficult experience with that. And Julie continues, I lived a lot of trauma due to my upbringing. Is it still appropriate to give merit to my parents and ancestors despite this for my meditation practice and dana? I have been able to heal myself in the recent years. Is this right view? Yes, absolutely. You should dedicate merit to them, because also recognizing that they did unwholesome things because of their own defilements and delusions. And mental illness, as you mentioned. So recognize then that if they did not have those afflictions and hindrances in their mind, then they would not have mistreated you. And by dedicating merit and blessings to them, wishing for them to be free of those afflictions, wishing them to be free of those hindrances, those defilements, delusions, and illnesses, then you're actually wishing the best for them. So absolutely, you should dedicate merit to them. In fact, doubly so. Because they mistreated you, all the more reason to dedicate merit to them, because you want them to be free of that. Because mistreating your children is really bad karma. So the Buddha does talk a lot about the importance of being respectful to your parents, but he also talks about the importance of parents being thoughtful and caring and supportive towards their children. That's also in the sutta. So we tend to focus more on the responsibility towards parents part, but the Buddha also spoke about responsibility towards children. And so it's important to have compassion for your parents, recognizing that not only were you harmed by their misconduct, but they were also harmed tremendously by what they were doing. So it was both coming from a place of their own damage, their own internal difficulties, but also they're compiling even more bad karma that's going to make it even harder for them. So absolutely, yes, dedicate merit to them, because you want them to break out of these cycles of bad karma. You want them to cultivate wisdom and compassion so that they can get free of that. So yes, absolutely, dedicate blessing. Every single day, dedicate merit to your parents. They need your metta as much as anybody else, if not more. PL says, Mangala Sutta talks about caring for children, puttadarasa, and parents as auspicious factors. Actually, puttadarasa means children and spouse, for the record. But yeah, the Buddha does mention that some of the highest blessings are caring for your parents, your children, and your spouse. Yeah. Verse 24. So it's missing all the diacritic marks, which makes it a little hard for me to understand. So whenever posting Pali quotes, always post it with the diacritic marks. Otherwise, it's much harder to read. I don't quite get the point of this quote.
I think it was from a question earlier around the Dhammapada verse. Remember, there was a question. I don't remember what the question was. Maybe PL, can you?
Yeah, it's again without the diacritics, it's a bit hard to discern the message. I mean, I can guess at the meaning of these words, but without the diacritics, some of it is just guessing.
Can you put links in here?
It's possible. People can post links.
Yeah.
So Pial, if you can post a link to that would help quite a bit. Yeah. I mean, we could look up the Dhammapada verse, but that would take time. So we should keep going with these questions. Okay. Scott says, I find family disharmony discombobulating. My best weapon is to recognize that this is suffering. Is there anything else I can do?
Oh, yeah. There's a bit of, I wouldn't say, it's not so much humor, but it's something that floats around a lot in monastic circles of, if you think you're making progress on the path of the Buddhist teaching, if you think, your sati and samadhi are getting really strong and steady, go visit your parents, go visit your family, a week, 2 weeks, a month, see how it goes. And you'll find out really quickly how whether your confidence was true or misplaced. Did you find it here, Venerable?
Yeah, I found the
Dhammapada.
But keep going with your
Oh,
answer,
okay.
and then we'll talk about the Dhammapada.
So is there anything else that I can do? Well, family disharmony. Oh boy, yeah. One thing that comes to mind is I don't know if there's any sutta where the Buddha goes over this, but this is just from my own experience. It's understanding one's, how do you say, that one might have this idea that one has, let's say, power or agency to affect the outcome of something that might be misplaced. So it'd be quite common for us to think, oh, the family is very disharmonious now. They're arguing with each other, or they're just acting crazy with each other. And you might have this sense of feeling responsible that you should do something to fix the issue. I'm not saying this is what's happening, but if that's what is happening, it's really important to recognize that perhaps that perception may not be accurate. That they're actually, one may not be able to do so much when the family is really in the thralls of going after each other. That said, what's useful to do is to recognize that there are things that one can do, right? And that might involve timing. So, for example, the family is in, full, I don't know, full interchange. Maybe take a step back. Don't engage. You don't have to be rude to everybody, but to find a way of pulling away. And then when you can, connect with one person at a time, maybe see if there are people within the family that you can be a positive and steady presence with, right? You may not be able to do this everybody, but if you can, let's say, for example, help out with one of the people in this family, then you're actually adding something positive to the disharmony, right? And it may not immediately affect anything, but at least what you're doing is you're providing a positive relation with that one other person, right? And you're giving yourself also the recipient of that. Every relationship involves at least two people, and so if you're helping out another person, you're helping out yourself. And so that's one way of looking at this. So instead of like trying to think about fixing the whole family, which is, again, I think is a unfortunate but common perception that many people carry for one reason or another. It's to try to recognize, oh, that perception may be mistaken. Try to take a step back and then try to find out, is there anything simple and direct and not complicated that I can add that might be useful?
Great, thank you. And Pial gave the Pali reference with the diacritics. We also found it in the Dhammapada. So it says, Arogya Parama Labha, Santuti Paramang Danang, Visasa Parama Nyati, and the last line is Nibbanang Paramang Sukhang. So you actually, you left out the most important phrase from that. So Arogya Parama Labha, so health is the highest gain. The Santuti Paramang Danang, contentment is the highest wealth. Visasa Paramanyati. So Visasa, again, you had translated it earlier as trust, which is one translation of that, but it's more, the meaning is certainty, or a sense of safety, a sense of security, a sense of confidence and trust, in the sense that you know that somebody's not going to harm you. So Visasa Paramanyati means that the greatest relative is this sense of trust or security, of surety in feeling safe. And then he says Nibbana Paramang Sukhang, which is one of my favorite quotes in the entire Pali Canon. So Nibbana is the highest happiness. But yeah, I mean, we could dig up more references with the word visasa, but I don't think we have time for that right now. But yeah, so I think what the Buddha is doing there is he's pointing to, again, the idea that we normally, for example, when we talk about gains, we tend to talk about gaining things like wealth and property and so on. And the Buddha is saying, well, that's actually not the best gain. The best gain is to be healthy, to be free of sickness. When we talk about wealth, again, we think about money and property, but he says actually the greatest wealth is contentment. And relatives, again, actually the word nyati literally just means people you know. So we normally translate it as relatives, but it actually literally just means people you know. So he's saying normally we want to have people we know who are friendly and delightful and so on, but actually says the best thing is to feel safe in their presence. So not necessarily having the smartest relatives or the richest relatives or whatever, but ones who you feel safe around. And of course, the highest pleasure is nibbana, so full awakening. And Tan Nick says, is divorce and separation acceptable, or should a good Buddhist just try to accept as much as possible? Well, so there's absolutely nowhere in the suttas where the Buddha says that divorce is unwholesome, nor is there anywhere in the suttas where he says separation is unwholesome. So these don't seem to be explicitly proscribed by the Buddha. He doesn't seem to explicitly prohibit them or discourage them. So I would just apply the more general principles of asking yourself, what causes the least harm to the people involved, and what brings the most benefit to the people involved? So, for example, if you're in a relationship where the two of you just bring out the worst qualities in each other, and both of you are like, you're always yelling at each other and always getting into like vicious fights and fueling each other's defilements, and well, actually, maybe it's a good time to separate. Might be a good idea. You might actually find that you're much better people when you're not around each other. In which case, I would say separation is probably actually the wholesome choice in that case. But if it's a different thing, like your partner loves you and cares about you a lot, but your neighbor is a lot cuter, and you kind of want to go start sleeping with your neighbor instead. So you want to get a separation, not because of any problem with your current relationship, but just because there's somebody else who's more attractive who you want to go for instead. Well, in that case, you need to be realistic that it's just about fueling your own defilements. And in that case, you should, as you say, just try to accept the situation and learn how to appreciate the partner that you currently have. As the Buddha said in the Dhammapada quote, Santuti Paramang Dhanam, contentment is the highest wealth. So being content also with your current partner rather than constantly trying to upgrade to a more attractive one or a younger one or whatever. But yeah, if you are just really fueling each other's defilements, then sometimes it's better to take a step back or possibly a lifetime back and set up conditions of living that support both of you to become better people. But it is difficult to evaluate sometimes because in a relationship, there's always two people involved. So you need to make sure you're not just going from strictly selfish motives and doing things which will hurt your partner, but rather, again, considering how your choices are affecting them as well. Do you have any thoughts on this? Divorce and separation?
Well said.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
And Tan Nick also asks, would sperm donation without informing spouse be breaking the third or fourth precepts? Do you want to take this one?
Let me give this a little thought. So, would a sperm donation without informing your spouse be breaking the third or fourth? So I'm guessing, like by sperm donation, there's some organization or facility that wants your sperm, like there's
No,
paying you?
So for people who want to become pregnant.
Yeah, it's usually to help people who have fertility problems.
Oh, I see. So
I know people who have had to deal with these issues.
Got it. So I see. I understand. So that's useful. And I'm assuming that people donate so that there's like a pool of different sperm and characteristics, and people can kind of choose from. Is that the idea, or
it can also be random?
Okay.
Yeah,
I see.
But the idea is it's for people who have trouble getting pregnant naturally.
I mean, it is a bit borderline, and the reason why I say it's borderline and not like, well, the fourth precept is on lying, and I can't say that's lying, but the third precept, it might be breaking trust, but it's going to be very dependent on the relationship that you have that person. I mean, on a more basic level, I would ask is why not just tell your partner? I mean, what's the problem? And if there is a problem, then that's actually what you need to look at. Does that make sense? It's not the sperm donation. It's like, why are you trying to be secretive?
Yeah, I agree. Yeah. And that's the last question from online. Do we have anything from in person? Yeah, go ahead.
Going back to the subject of divorce, if an individual has parents who are, I guess, abusive or toxic relationship, and my question is about the individual, like the child's, about divisive speech. Like if you're telling the mother or father to split up, is that negative karma? If you're seeing that there is clearly suffering, like what is divisive speech in terms of our relationship with our parents?
So I think again it comes back to your intentions. So ideally, you would try to find some way to help them resolve their conflicts. But if that doesn't seem possible, so sometimes there's these kind of like awkward situations where the parents really actually do want to split up, but they stay together for the children. But the children also want the parents to split up because the children also think it's a bad relationship and not the best thing. So then it just winds up with everybody being unhappy with the situation. So again, I don't think there's actually a hard line yes or no answer, but you have to really evaluate the situation and really ask, what can I do that is going to bring the greatest benefit to all the people affected? And if you're acting from that kind of wholesome intention and you're very careful to consider the consequences of your choices, then generally speaking, you'll be okay. And so depending upon the circumstances, that might mean trying to get your parents to resolve their conflicts while staying together, or it might mean encouraging them to separate. But it's going to be circumstantial. It's not something where we can make a blanket statement. But it has to be based upon that genuine motivation of wanting to bring the greatest benefit to the people affected and reduce the harm as much as possible. And really thinking through the potential implications and consequences of each possible course of action that you might take.
May I ask a follow-up?
Yeah, go ahead.
So if people have resentment towards their parents, and this is obviously based on what you've said about our mother, would be very negative karma to have resentment towards one's mother. How does one heal that that error in ignorance that was made in ignorance? How should one work towards what's the word, reconciliation or remedial action towards that resentment?
First things is recognize where you're at. And what I mean by that is that people, you or others will be at different places. Sometimes the resentment can be, significant but not overpowering. Sometimes it can be quite strong. Sometimes it can, for some people, it might provoke such a strong physical reaction. They can't even, think about the person without, getting nauseous, for example. Or so it's important to recognize where you're at first, and to um, when recognize the unpleasantness and the pain associated with holding on to that resentment, and using that as a motivation. In other words, it's not so much like it will benefit the other person to relinquish this resentment, but it's really kind of to bring it back into oneself. I'm in a lot of pain holding on to this resentment, holding on to this idea that one day maybe I will get back at this person, or whatever it is that the mind hopes will happen at some future point in time. And it's really just like, right now I'm suffering, and maybe a little, maybe a lot, maybe a tremendous amount. And so that the impetus is actually around taking care of oneself. And then when one is able to generate some momentum around that, I think at that point, then one can start to do things that are focused on, let's say, around one's mother, whoever, or father, whoever the person is. But I think from my experience is that you really have to start with where you are, get an accurate assessment of what's going on, and then really try to motivate oneself as based on one's suffering and dukkha.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know if you have any thoughts about that.
No, that's good.
Okay.
Any other? Elliot, you have a question?
Yeah, I'll try to be as concise as I can, because it's kind of a lot of background that I'm planning on giving. So I've become friends with a few people in my life over the years who kind of suffer from long-term afflictions like mental illness, or in the case of my brother, but I feel like it's kind of like real neurosis, to the point where, and anyways, from what I remember in the Kalyanamitta Sutta, one of the virtues of a Kalyanamitta is they don't abandon others. And at the same time, from what I also remember, the Buddha taught not to associate with foolish people. And I have a hard time when I'm in the midst of relationship with people who can unwittingly harm me, of having enough clarity to know when to say no. And what ends up usually happening is it comes to like a shattering moment where I burn out, and then the response is really just total withdrawal. One of my questions is about if you have any advice on negotiating such situations. And the second question is on if there's any implication in the Buddhist teachings that one would have a different obligation to one's brother, which is family in a sense, as opposed to someone who considers one family but isn't blood relatives.
Well, let me try to take, because I feel like there's multiple questions. So the first one was, the first basic question is around having a relationship with somebody, and you don't want to abandon them. At the same time, there's a lot of you brought up like the Mangala Sutta, avoiding fools, basically, and it's how do you negotiate that?
Yeah.
Is that the first question?
Yeah.
Okay. How do you negotiate that? I think one really important element of that can affect one's ability to negotiate this, if one feels that one can't abandon the relationship. And what I mean by that is that can one genuinely feel like, okay, I can walk away from this? So what I mean, because if you feel strongly that you can't walk away from this, it's going to affect your ability to negotiate in a way that can be firm and effective. So if one is, feeling, well, I really have to have this relationship, and then you try to negotiate with this person, that's likely to come out, that feeling of insecurity, or that notion that you can't do without this person. And so it's worth recognizing, is that the case? Can you live? Are you willing to walk away from this relationship? Are you willing to say no and not speak with this person for some predetermined amount of time? Because if one has that clarity and confidence around that, then one can go, okay, I'm confident and I'm willing to do this if it's necessary, but I would prefer to have some sort of relationship. And then one could start to figure out at that point, hopefully with the other person, with a dialogue with the other person, to say, okay, what can we do here, right? So does that help?
No, it's very helpful. The issue is one of these friends has attempted suicide before. There's another one that I'm not really in contact with whose suicide was attempted several times. Another friend whose mental health afflictions are permanent, and as such, I can't really consistently have like these dialogues where he would be self-aware about my concerns and be able to express himself thoughtfully and clearly.
Yeah,
it's entangled.
Yeah. So if you don't feel like you can, like, kind of in a good faith way, like you said, negotiate or to have a dialogue, then you have to meet at that level. That's just where reality is meeting you right now. So unless Venerable, do you have any other thoughts about that kind of situation? I mean, my thought is that there isn't too much one can do in terms of trying to talk to somebody if they can't talk. But
yeah, I mean, and when dealing with extreme mental illness, it's also important to recognize our own limitations, and that there are people who train their entire professional life precisely in learning how to help people who have those kinds of conditions. And I am not one of them, and I believe you are not one of them. So people who have serious mental illnesses, let the professionals take care of that. And so then our responsibility is usually about trying to connect those people with the professionals who are most well equipped to help them. And so sometimes the way that one is a supportive friend to someone like that is connecting them with mental health professionals, but keeping personal distance. Because as you mentioned before, having too close of a personal connection winds up harming you. So we also need to recognize that it's not our job to be martyrs for everyone that we meet. And that actually often the most compassionate thing to do is to step away from someone. If we recognize the relationship is harmful, then we step away. And if we do want to help, then in cases like that, you help by trying to connect them with mental health professionals who can actually support them in a more well-trained way. And did you have another comment? I
think it sounds like we're running out of time.
We're running low on time, and there's some more questions here.
Let's keep going.
We can talk more another time.
Oh, right. You had the second question. Yeah, maybe
I'll be all right.
Okay.
Yeah, he comes pretty often.
Okay.
And Richard says, what is the best approach to create more wholesome harmony with aging parents who are stuck in limited, prideful, negative, and emotionally immature attitudes, but are generally kind-natured beings? Don't expect to change them. Instead, appreciate their good qualities. So generally speaking, the older people get, the more intractable they become. This is not universally true, but it's generally true. So you have elderly parents who are stuck in some not so delightful qualities. Okay, great. Your job is to tolerate that. But you say they have a generally kind nature. Great. Your job is to appreciate that, to praise that, to enjoy that, and focus on that as much as possible whenever you interact with them. And the other not so delightful qualities, you learn how to put up with it, because you're not going to change that, most likely. And you can try, but good luck. Success rate probably less than 1%.
Yeah. I've had this experience of trying to change a parent, and it didn't work.
Yeah, usually doesn't.
Yeah.
Especially when you're their little baby. It doesn't matter if their little baby is 50 years old. You're still their little baby. So it's often really hard for parents to take their children that seriously, because they still remember wiping your butt when you were 1 year old, and now you're trying to teach them high spiritual wisdom, and they're still thinking you of that like little 1 year old that was running around without their pants on. So it's often difficult for parents to take their adult children that seriously. So your job is just to appreciate their good qualities and be patient and tolerant with their not so good qualities. And that's the last question from online. Daniel, you had a question earlier, or is that still going? We have a few minutes, it's fine.
Yeah, actually, I wanted to ask about the debt to your parents that can never be repaid. It seems to me almost that this is not as much because my parents were good to me and took care of me. I mean, there are lots of mothers who give birth to babies already addicted to drugs or this kind of thing. But simply the fact that I have been invited to exist, or not exist, but I've been born as a human, rather than like a dung beetle or something.
Yeah.
And that seems quite relevant. Is that kind of on track with what you're saying?
Oh, it's definitely part of it, yeah. But also, like I was saying, just the mere fact that your mother literally fed you with her own body as the fetus was growing. This is no small thing. This is actually a really, really big thing. And yeah, I mean, there are cases of parents who abandon their children when they're born, or who give very harmful, unhealthy upbringings to their children, if they even give an upbringing at all. But for most people, when they think about their parents, they can usually think of something kind or supportive that their parents have done for them. And maybe it was misguided, because realistically, most people's parents are unenlightened, so they're acting from some degree of wrong view. But generally speaking, most people, when they think about their parents, they can think of some amount of goodness their parents have done for them. And usually they can think of a lot. So of course, if you ask me to complain about my parents, I can complain for hours. But if you ask me to speak about all the good things they've done for me, I can speak for many more hours. If I start listing things, we're going to be here for days. So that's what the Buddha is encouraging us to focus on. So of course, our parents have made mistakes here and there. But even the worst parents have usually done at least some genuine good for their children. So with some very rare exceptions, most people can think of something. Yeah.
One thing I was thinking about in terms of relationship with parents or difficulty with family members is this habit of blame. And quite often I've heard people express, if it wasn't for so-and-so, let's say my mother, I would be happy. But if it wasn't for my father, I would be crazy, or whatever it is. And this is compelling, for those that have a mind that is that tends towards blame. And I would, if you find yourself, if that seems to fit the bill for you, that you tend to have a mind that gears towards blame, whether it's a parent or other people or society or whatnot. I think it's really important to try to spend some time to investigate that movement towards blame, and trying to put some attention and care around understanding how that process works. And the reason why I feel that way is just from my own experience with blame, in that it's very much from my experience, it's very much a habit, and it's something that offers some degree of comfort because it's explanatory. It, it gives like a simple, way of focusing one's, hurt, resentment. But what it also does, it also like masks the reality that we're in pain. So that's a lot of times like things like anger, resentment, like that. They tend to draw the mind out from the experience of pain and get the mind kind of focusing in a kind of outward direction. And so when one gets more familiar with that process, one can develop a degree of, I'm trying to think of the right word. One can know it better, basically. And one doesn't get sucked into it. And one gets a feeling for how it gets started. And one gets a confidence to not pick it up and run with it when you start to see your mind go in that direction. And so blame is very compelling. It's very compelling. But everybody here, and I would hope most people listening to this teaching online, have a meditation practice. And this is, I think, a very important tool, because we can use sati and samadhi to as a basis for investigating these tendencies. Whereas, without these, you're just, these things, it's hard to see what your minds are doing. So use the opportunity and the tools that you have to investigate these tendencies of mind. So I hope that helps.
Great. And we're just about out of time. So thank you, Venerable Jagaro, for sharing some wonderful words of Dhamma this evening. And thank you to all the people offering questions and comments to help fuel further conversation. So at this time, we can conclude the session with 3 sadhus. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. And we'll see you next time.